1878, Montana frontier. Fierce gales ripped down the crazy mountains with a vengeance, battering sanctuary panes and whipping up blinding grit as Odessa faced the clergyman silent, weeping, dampening her pale face. Stifling her own lungs, she fought to swallow the cries. Yet ragged gasps escaped anyway, echoing a shattered soul. She was tying her life to an unknown man. The towering, weather-beaten figure looming beside her nervously gripped a battered Stetson with rough fingers. They called him Nolan Nash, a rancher working the deep Bitterroot borders. Prior to this morning, they had crossed paths exactly twice. Initially, while her brother, Owen, bartered her future, and later when she begged for mercy. He remained entirely mute back then, offering only a single nod from beneath shadowed, intensely observant eyes, as if hearing her unspoken terror. Presently, he finally broke, the silence murmuring just for her ears, his sleeve lightly grazing her trembling frame. "I will bring you joy, eventually." That soft declaration struck like sudden fire in a freezing winter. Glancing upward, her bloodshot gaze reflected absolute shock. He lacked the refined elegance typical of urban gentlemen. Instead, his sharp, sun-baked features mapped out brutal frosts and deeply agonizing decisions. Yet his gaze remained, incredibly gentle and unwavering, allowing her to exhale. The sermon droned onward. Nearby, her brother Owen rigidly observed with folded arms and a clenched jaw. Owen owed money, whereas Nolan possessed acres and livestock. Romance never factored in. This meant staying alive. Odessa possessed zero leverage. Yet Nolan kept his distance, requiring absolutely nothing, merely remaining solidly, planted like granite, while swearing a gentle vow. Leaving the small settlement completely mute, Odessa huddled beneath the thick fleece blanket while Nolan steered the cart single-handedly, keeping a slack grip on the leathers. Her new gold band weighed like lead. She studied it before watching the mysterious endless plains rolling outward. "Need any grub?" he inquired. Eventually, she declined silently. Acknowledging this, he dropped the subject. Dusk brought them to his remote property, a modest shack nestled under a ridge, featuring an equine shelter and gray exhaust drifting from the roof. An older, hardened woman stepped into the yard, sporting silver locks and shouldering a loaded long gun. This the girl she questioned. Dismounting, Nolan explained Odessa meet May. "She raised me when my parents died." May inspected her thoroughly, unflinching though not cruel. "Broth is hot. Get indoors." Inside smelled of cedar, wild hair, and burning logs. Odessa huddled rigidly aside as Nolan stored his jacket, watching May scoop thick soup into dishes. "Consume this," May ordered. "A stiff breeze might blow you away." Chewing simply provided a necessary distraction for her frantic mind. Nolan consumed his meal silently, covertly tracking her movements. Gathering her empty dish to wash, her fingers trembled violently. Grabbing her wrists, May provided stability. "You never wanted this arrangement," the older woman whispered. "Still, he possesses a decent heart. He would never harm you." Swallowing hard, Odessa agreed silently. Later igniting a lantern in the main quarters, Nolan gestured toward the mattress. "The floor suits me fine." Nodding once more, she felt simultaneously deeply relieved and horribly embarrassed. Hesitating, he promised her total security. Afterward, time dragged heavily. Odessa scrubbed floors, hauled buckets, and repaired torn fabrics. Nolan wrangled livestock, fixed broken boundaries, and vanished into misty dawns. He'd return, caked in trail grit. He kept his distance, never questioning those muffled midnight sobs she thought he missed. Yet he heard every tear. Tiny offerings began appearing on the timber block. Prairie blooms stuffed in glass, some honeyed, smoking leaf for myself. A scribbled scrap promising rig requires mending, but will hit the settlement shortly. She remained mute, though the ice around her spirit slowly thawed. Until dawn broke with Nolan rousing her sharply. "Move fast." Near the boundary wire, Nolan crouched next to a tiny waif, roughly 6 years old, sporting matted locks and busted boots. A lad lingered at her back, perhaps 3 winters her senior, shielding her small frame. "Discovered him near the wash," Nolan muttered. "Ain't no folks around." Odessa crouched, Who might you be? Clara, the youngster, breathed. That right there is Caleb. Odessa and Nolan scrubbed their dirt away, offered grub, and calmed their trembling. By twilight, the youngsters huddled under a patchwork blanket, while Odessa guarded the veranda, crossing her arms. What happened to their kin, she demanded. Nolan gazed toward the shadowy ridges, spotted a flipped rig downriver, completely gutted. Just tiny footprints. Left behind, he agreed with a grim nod. Seems that way. Odessa gripped her fists tight, the phantom pain of being discarded after her mama passed once her pa drowned his sorrows in whiskey and her brother traded her freedom for livestock vouchers, burned anew. She faced her husband. We're keeping him, yeah. He locked eyes with her, truly seeing her, and affirmed, absolutely. Time bled on. Odessa began untangling Clara's tresses at daybreak, crooning forgotten prairie melodies. Caleb trailed Nolan relentlessly, desperate to lend a hand and absorb frontier skills. Nolan schooled the boy in leatherwork repairs and riding the perimeter. Odessa even spied Nolan grinning briefly when the lad nailed a lasso throw. Following a hearty dusk meal, Clara climbed right into Odessa's embrace unprompted. Stiffening initially, she eventually hugged the child back. You carry the scent of baking spices, Clara murmured, drifting off. Odessa lifted her gaze, catching Nolan observing them from the roaring fireplace. A heavy, silent emotion filled his stare. He refused to blink. She held firm. Winter's inaugural blizzard drifted down lazily. Odessa lingered by the glass, tracking the feather-like descent. Nolan stepped near her back, keeping a respectable gap yet nearer than his usual boundary. The sorrow still biting, he rumbled softly. She agreed. Now and then. Pausing, he added, I stood by my promise. I'll bring you joy. Eventually. She pivoted toward him. You've already managed that. Suddenly the heavy frontier cabin tension dissolved. He extended a rugged palm, gently grazing her knuckles. Nothing aggressive, just a solid, heated connection. Odessa stood her ground. Retreat wasn't an option tonight. Frost bit the land prematurely that season, gripping the riverbanks like an unforgiving predator. Odessa swaddled Clara in thick wool before braving the chicken coop, clutching the tiny fingers tightly. Dawn remained deathly still, broken only by towering pines snapping under the freezing weight. Odessa navigated the treacherous, icy mud with caution, her exhales painting white plumes. The flock rustled indoors, while she harvested yolks into a wooden pail the boys had crafted. Clara tallied every single shell in hushed whispers, her gaze sharp and rhythm unbroken. Odessa studied her briefly, then tenderly swept a stray lock away from the child's face. Got more grit than most adults, she muttered. Clara stayed silent, offering only a gentle grin, keeping a tight grip on Caleb's fingers as they braved the harsh frontier air toward the cabin steps. Back indoors, dying embers snapped in the hearth. May sat hunched nearby, firelight catching the steel needle as she worked heavy yarn over her knees. Odessa spotted Nolan's heavy duster thrown over a seat, that ripped shoulder now neatly bound up. You're mighty handy with that. Needle, Odessa murmured, dropping the egg basket. May kept her eyes down. Stops my mind from wandering to dark places. Some memories ain't worth the trouble. Odessa gave a solemn nod, filling the iron pot for boiling. Once the morning light finally crested those jagged peaks, Nolan rode back into camp, 2 dead jackrabbits hanging from his pommel. The Mustang panted white clouds into the freezing air as he swung down. Odessa silently unlatched the heavy door. Kicking ice off his spurs, he hauled the fresh meat toward the larder, knowing exactly where the game belonged in this brutal winter. As twilight fell and the young ones pushed wooden toys near the flames, Odessa lingered by. The frosted glass arms crossed tight, staring into the gathering blackness. Nolan shed his jacket and stepped up beside her. She kept her gaze fixed, though she held her ground. Word is a physician's making the trek from Bozeman, he murmured. May caught wind from a local fur trader ought to arrive within the month. Anybody ailing, she questioned. Nah, just figured a professional I ought to check Clara's nasty chest rattle. Plus, Caleb's busted shoulder locks up bad whenever the frost bites. Staring out at the desolate plains, she agreed. Reckon they'll stick around come the thaw. Silence stretched between them. Sure pray they do, but I ain't chaining anyone to this harsh land. That made her finally look back, studying his weathered features. You'd set them loose, just so they could find peace somewhere else. Odessa examined her calloused palms. Surrendering folks like that doesn't make a person a coward, right? Hell no, he whispered. Takes the toughest kind of backbone. Hours later, with the kids tucked in and May asleep, Odessa haunted the dying fireside. Nolan rested opposite her, some old novel resting on his knees, though his eyes hadn't moved in hours. Used to hold a melody she rasped. Mama would whistle doing chores and it'd echo right behind her. He broke his gaze from the pages. What silenced you? Lost the spirit for music the day they buried her. She paused, voice cracking slightly. Can't even recall her tone nowadays. Just an empty echo of what it was. He shut his volume. You can always find that rhythm again. Nobody out in this wilderness will judge you. Odessa remained mute while logs sparked in the grate. Slowly, a whisper of a lullaby slipped from her lips, barely cutting the terrible silence. Nolan stayed absolutely motionless, drinking in the sound. Dawn broke with brutal gales violently shaking the cabin walls. Caleb shadowed Nolan's every footstep, assisting with the meager survival rations hauled from the nearest settlement days ago. Odessa and May guarded boiling frontier broth, while little Clara wrestled with scrap fabric and sewing tools, biting her lip in absolute stubborn focus. May stared out the icy panes, blizzards brewing fast. Odessa simply agreed. Well, survived the tempest. By midnight, heavy drifts completely barricaded the only exit. Nolan inspected the groaning rafters before stoking the flames. Handing Odessa a tin mug of dark brew, their fingers briefly collided. She didn't flinch or retreat. Obliged, she whispered into the dark. His gaze held hers in the dim light. The nights are hard. I've heard the weeping. A sudden hitch in her chest, yet she kept staring defiant. Didn't figure bringing it up would bring any comfort, he murmured. Just know my ears are open. A single sharp nod was her reply. Understood. Silence hung before she spoke. You ain't the man I pictured. Blessing or curse? A genuine grin finally broke. The jury's still out. A rough, gravelly laugh escaped his chest. Can't argue there. As she stood to tend the kids, he matched her posture, keeping distant. Hesitating at the threshold, she cast a glance backwards. Her voice it's coming back. No questions followed. The unspoken phantom hung heavily between them both. Beyond, the timber blizzards raged against their steadfast hearth. The physician arrived, mid-storm tires completely swallowed by freezing mud, before the men dragged his exhausted frame onto the covered deck. A dense, sturdy fellow, carrying the brutal marks of a battered medical bag brushing off a deep hack as mere trail dust settling inside. Hot brew and a warm rag were quickly shoved forward. Shadows lengthened as he checked the youngsters near glowing embers, steam clouding his wire-rimmed glasses. Tough little survivors, he declared, gently resting his tin mug on scarred wood. Her chest needs time to mend, but shall shake the rattle. That lad's wing might stay crooked, but hell be powerful. A silent nod of acceptance followed. Well, take that. Bedding down upstairs, the medic departed at dawn. Provisions stuffed in pockets and wool wrapping his legs, the little girl observed his departure face buried deep into her protector's heavy skirt's tiny hands gripping the rough fabric tightly like a lifeline. Later that harsh afternoon, the men were out hauling heavy timber to secure the outer grazing boundary entirely. Solitude found the woman rummaging through rusted iron in the barn, unearthing a mysterious carved chest hidden behind shattered tack. It held ancient correspondence, brittle parchments sporting elegant fading script. Temptation gnawed, but she kept them firmly sealed. Opting for respect, she hauled the relic outside, carefully planting it near the rancher's resting spot. Wiping wood shavings off his forearms, his eyes locked onto it. Where was that hiding? Buried near the harnesses. Pried nothing loose, she swore. A rough finger traced the worn hinges. These are from my ma. Left them for a boy barely old enough to spell, let alone grasp their heavy burdens. Lowering herself onto the freezing planks, she probed softly. Any clear memories remain. Mainly her smile. How she'd grip her steaming tin cup like it held fire. She studied his weathered profile briefly. For me, it's the thud of my old man's leather soles hitting the floorboards. That and cheap burning leaf. He offered no words, only his attention. Breaking the quiet, she murmured. She sang folk tunes of the water. Figured it was mere folklore until I stumbled onto the very banks she echoed about. Right over that treacherous divide, the current finally surrenders and pools quietly. It's my sanctuary from this brutal world. A slow, heavy nod acknowledged her confession. He'll saddle up alongside you next trip out. Silence reigned, yet rejection never came. 7 days later, the punishing freeze finally surrendered an inch. Ice turned to brittle glass, with a ghostly daylight clinging desperately to the horizon. The women scoured the frozen earth for firewood, leaving others churning harsh lye over open flames. The men tracked the distant perimeter, the youngsters' boots stretching further, hardened by the brutal landscape, as night choked the valley. Those two ended up alone near the hearth post-meal. The others retreated to their bunks early, escaping a pounding skull ache. The little ones finally slumbered. By the dying fire's embers swaddled beneath Odessa's rugged, hand-stitched blankets. "Ever dream about escaping?" she whispered, wiping damp fingers. Once, Nolan muttered, "A lifetime ago. Figured it'd drift downward to the Badlands. Yet something kept me anchored." She rested against the timber. "Duty." Nah. Hated wandering without a soul waiting behind. His gaze caught hers, stripped of burdens, bearing nothing but raw honesty. Struck totally silent, Odessa gulped. I craved booming towns, spots where my past stayed buried. Strolling crowded boardwalks, hauling strictly my personal ghosts. Still craving that escape. She declined, softly. Past that. Now I merely want tranquil sunrises without the shouting. He drifted closer, cautiously. You found that sanctuary. Impulsively, her fingertips grazed his frayed cuffs. Understood. He captured her palms, sturdy and heated. They froze like statues, accompanied strictly by snapping timber within the blazing hearth. At dawn, Odessa awoke early, personally rigging up the pack horse, stuffing her grip sack with hardtack and withered fruit. She entered the quarters just as Nolan yanked up his leathers. Heading down toward the crossing, she murmured, "Care to tag along?" Unsmiling, he gave zero confirmation, simply snatching his duster and tailing her outside. The creek rested silently beneath a harsh winter glare. Frost-lined edges whistled under bitter gales. Taking a seat upon a smooth boulder overlooking the shallows, she grounded her soles into frozen mud, securing her petticoats tightly. Nolan lingered several yards back. Hitching the reins to timber, he studied her steady, rhythmic breathing. "This your hideout for absolute silence?" he muttered. Staring at the rapids, she agreed. "My one true piece of solitary territory." He crept forward, maintaining respectful distance, and settled down nearby, inspecting the sluggish tide. Pa always reckoned streams hold memories folks abandon. Frowning, Odessa shot him a puzzled glare. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Could not tell you," he confessed. "Reckon it signifies sorrow sinking low, while happiness skims the surface, both existing together." Pausing, she finally replied, "I formerly viewed mourning as a heavy burden to pack, assuming that dropping it proved you despised whatever vanished." Nolan's vision remained locked upon the rushing water. Tilting toward the daylight, she exhaled. Nowadays, perhaps, misery merely demands witnessing, not hoarding. A raven screeched from the evergreens towering nearby. Fishing out some cord and his whittling blade, Nolan started shaving down a thin sapling stick. His deliberate strokes sparked her curiosity. "Crafting something." "Tackle spool," he replied. "Caleb wants lessons." Odessa tracked the sliding steel. That boy matured faster this season than humanly imaginable. A sharp observer, quick study. She grinned softly. "Sounds awfully familiar." Eyes downcast, he mumbled, "Me." Odessa chuckled, genuinely surprising herself. A natural, hearty sound. Halting his blade, Nolan locked stares with her. "Second time today," he observed. "What?" A genuine grin. "Don't push your luck, cowboy," she warned. Even with a burning flush on her cheeks, they lingered until the sun bled into amber. Heading back up the trail, Little Clara sprinted out to greet them, braids slapping. Her spine and face flushed from the biting frost. "We got mail," she gasped. "The rider brought it. May reckons it belongs to you." Odessa scowled. "For me?" Grabbing that rigid parchment, she stared at ink strokes she barely remembered. She ducked into the cabin, leaving Nolan tending the livestock with the girl. Over at the hearth, May was, brewing a concoction thick with spiced apple scents. "It is my brother," Odessa muttered, keeping her tone hushed. The old cook never looked back. "You hold 0 debts to that man." Odessa sliced the seal fingers unflinching. His message was brief, the ink carved violently deep into the page. He was venturing toward the sunrise, having traded away his final scraps of property. He was begging her to come back to their roots and rebuild his ruined life. Tucking the note away, she dropped it on the fireplace shelf. May agreed. "Never figured you would cave." Later that evening, Odessa framed the threshold as Nolan pried off his muddy kickers. Both kids had already drifted off, leaving the homestead, wrapped in that rare, heavy peace earned after a day of brutal chores. "Do you ever ponder what our future holds out here?" she whispered. He rose up carefully. "You mean whether the youngsters remain? If they mature in this dirt, if they claim this land as theirs?" Closing the distance, he answered. "It weighs on my mind constantly." Slipping her fingers into his, she said, "Then perhaps we should forge a true sanctuary. For our own sake, too." Nolan locked eyes with her, his calloused grip tightening securely. "Are you certain?" She gave a nod. "I stopped waking up in tears. That is my proof." He leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to her brow that outspoke any sworn oath. She gasped, completely free of any grief, feeling a fierce, unbreakable resolve taking root. Retiring for dusk, she abandoned her lonely parlor bedding. She remained right there, nestling close under the frayed hide covers his heavy embrace, shielding her spine. Gale winds howled through the timber outside, yet utter stillness guarded their shelter. Roots were finally taking hold. The 3rd month arrived, bringing a fierce, unexpected melting. Frozen earth turned to muck while stubborn sprouts pierced the dying frost, hugging the shelter's shadowed edges. Standing bootless on the wooden planks at dawn, Odessa, weighted skirts soaking up icy puddles tracking the rhythmic groans of a carriage rumbling down the western pass. Nolan emerged from the shadows at her back, pulling his thick duster tight. "That is the Tanner crew. Those brothers operate the Eastern lumber camp." The rig halted. A pair of rugged fellas sat up top, dusted in sawdust and draped in heavy slickers. The elder brother offered a polite brim touch. "We are framing a fresh stable near the northern stream," he announced. "Desperately need reliable muscle and another rig. Figured you would want the gig." Nolan shot a questioning look toward his partner. "I have hungry folks to feed here." "You will make it back before dusk," the younger brother interjected. "Only for a fortnight, tops." Odessa wasted no time. "Accept their deal." He eyed her with glaring hesitation. "You have sacrificed enough sweat for this dirt claim," she told him directly. "Time to reap some rewards." Once the strangers departed, Odessa pivoted toward the kids peeking through the glass. "We will manage the frontier duties ourselves. The cook will teach you both proper snare hunting." Grumbling under her breath regarding reckless youth and injuries, May snatched her heavy jacket anyway. The following week unfolded flawlessly. Down by the southern acreage, Odessa was schooling little Clara on breaking the tough prairie dirt, pointing out exactly which patches were still frozen solid and which ones finally surrendered to the thaw. Come nightfall, Caleb would, read by the glow of an oil lamp, his shaky tone finding true grit with each turned leaf. Old May claimed the curing shed as her own territory, while Odessa kept the iron stove roaring, making the timber walls heavy with the rich aroma of spiced bone broth. Nearing the end of their first week, the brutal frontier grind actually started feeling like a natural harmony. Later that day, Odessa saddled. The kid was begging to spot those wild mountain plums blossoming deep down in the Kid Gulch, sparking Odessa's memory of her own mother showing her those exact trees, the only living things tough enough to flower early. The pair rode back right as the sun dipped beneath the home horizon. only to spot Nolan's trusted stallion hitched securely to their front post. Stepping through the door, they found him planted at the heavy oak table, gripping a creased document, his heavy duster still dripping off the trail moisture. Odessa froze on the threshold. "Back sooner than expected. We wrapped up the job early," he muttered, pushing up from his chair. Aimed to beat the pitch blackness home. The frontier had aged him, deepened the shadows under his brow. Yet his grin held an unshakable, silent confidence. Brushing the trail dust from her palms, she closed the distance. "Did outriding clear your head any? It just proved exactly what I am fighting to return to." He extended the battered parchment toward her. "The Timber Syndicate is offering me a solid piece of their operation. Told me the western claim is mine, if I front the cash come spring thaw." She gingerly accepted the contract. "Does this mean we abandon the herd?" "No, it just means no more solitary drifting on the plains. I would be rooted right here." He left it at that. The silence spoke volumes. Tucking the letter away, she rested it above the hearth. "Then we will make it happen." Once night fell, Nolan hauled a steaming kettle to their quarters as Odessa smoothed over the fresh bedding May had recently patched together. The youngsters were dead to the world in their bunks, and the brutal winds had surrendered to a gentle breeze, making the window drapes dance. He passed her a heated rag. "You are wearing half the prairie on your face." She grasped it, letting it sit idle. "Do you ever dream of forging a fresh legacy on this dirt, rather than just surviving day to day?" Closing the gap between them, he answered, "Constantly." She raised her hand, resting it softly against his jaw. "Then it is high time we quit acting like we are just trying not to die. We are going to raise an empire that outlives us both." He pulled her in for a deeply grounded kiss. Nothing frantic, purely resolute, much like his character. She melted against him, calloused hands, and all feeling his fevered breaths wash over her jawline, while the flickering shadows swallowed the quiet room. By the time the spring rains hit, they had stripped the northern stretch bare. Caleb and Nolan hammered together a fowl coop while May showed the young girl how to stain fleece with moss and dried peels. Odessa buried seeds in mathematically straight trenches, sinking her hands deep into the unforgiving territory. On a crisp Sabbath sunrise, Nolan produced a tiny hand-carved timber chest. Resting inside was a gleaming band deeply engraved with the intricate shape of a woodland branch. "I never did this the proper way back then," he murmured quietly, "but I am laying my claim now if you will have it." Grasping it firmly, she slid it onto her finger in complete silence. Her gaze was fierce and glassy, though she refused to let a single drop fall. During the scorching months, they expanded their homestead, framing out 2 extra living quarters and digging a root bunker. Caleb coated the front entry in crimson, while Clara strung dehydrated citrus from the roof beams, claiming it warded off creeping widowmakers. The freezing season eventually claimed old May's life, leaving her perfectly still with her hands bound and a heavy tapestry drawn tight to her neck. She drifted into the grate, beyond peacefully surrounded by Odessa's soft reading, and Nolan standing guard at the threshold. That shallow grave went under. The eastern cottonwood where Clara seeded wild bluebonnets to hide the marker. Time dragged heavy yet strangely complete. Nolan worked the timber claim, swinging his axe until noon, dragging in with sawdust clinging to his boots and pioneer whispers inside his coat. Odessa gathered the rugged, neighbor children turning their parlor into a makeshift sanctuary for reading and hymns. Young Caleb hardened into a towering, flint-eyed rancher, claiming the wandering herd as his solitary burden. By age 12, Clara tailored a canvas gown, stubbornly shunning all other garments from that day forward. Dusk settled, biting cold, after the winter freeze, finding Nolan and Odessa sharing the dark veranda, nursing bitter chicory brew. He muttered, "Recall my promise to bring joy back to your face." Resting her brow against his collarbone, she whispered, "I haven't forgotten a single shadow." Pale constellations vanished behind the ridge, while a restless gale whipped the prairie grass, wandering without destination. The pair lingered motionless, while the cabin hearth dwindled to glowing ash as the suffocating frontier darkness swallowed them whole, masking the brutal life they forged. Their survival built a muted peace and hard-won affection, a cabin harboring there, silent ghosts, and the quiet strength of a family carved from the American West.